Rev Life podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy, and this is Pastor Josh.
Yep. Let's go.
We're so excited that you've been joining us in this series and discussing on apologetics, just talking about how to defend our faith. And this episode in particular is a continuation from our previous episode, where in our previous episode we talked about just a couple things to keep in mind while having apologetic conversations.
Yeah.
One, the burden of proof. Two, identifying logical fallacies. And in this episode, we'll be addressing the third thing to include and identify, which is tactics.
Yeah. Tactics, right? Ways to continue and engage in that conversation in a healthy, but also logical way. And I'll reiterate too, we're building on ourselves here. This is the fifth part of an apologetics series we're doing in our podcast. And so if you haven't listened to the other ones, I would encourage you to go back, start at number 1, because we're building on a lot. We're assuming that you've already heard a lot. And so this one, we're continuing, like you said, a third helpful tip when engaging in these conversations, tactics. And I'm actually pulling this from a book called Tactics. And so if you're wanting to study this further, the entire apologetic conversation, it's a great book on the topic. And I love the way he breaks down different tactics within apologetic conversations. And so I pulled them from there. And I think it'll be great topics for conversation. So there's 5 tactics. I believe he has more in his book, but these are like my 5 favorites that I wanted to share. The first one is the Columbo tactic. It's named after the fictional detective Columbo, which I have no idea who that is. Do you know who that is?
I know Christopher Columbus.
There's that one. I don't think he was a detective, right? Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, or whatever the saying, however that goes.
Something like that.
So this tactic involves asking questions to gather information and guide the conversation.
Yeah.
This is probably going to be the one that we will mostly use because it's the most helpful, and I think you really, when you're engaging in these apologetic conversations, you have no idea where these people are coming from until you really ask a lot of questions. And so this is probably the most commonly used tactic. And asking those clarifying questions, which is referencing our third podcast, asking leading questions, right? It helps you clarify the other person's beliefs, might even uncover some inconsistencies or logical fallacies, which allows you to gently challenge those assumptions or fallacies that they might be making. So if the person says, how can you believe in a God you can't see? Right? We might say, that's an interesting question. Can you tell me why you think that seeing is the only way to believing in something? You're addressing what they're saying, but you're pressing in deeper, trying to understand where they're coming from and what they actually believe. So that's going to only continue and further the conversation in a way that is done so with gentleness and respect, right? That's the guiding principles, if you will, that we find in 1 Peter that we've talked about. Second one, this guy, he calls it the taking the roof off tactic. I love his names for the different tactics. Taking the roof off. This tactic involves exposing faulty reasoning or assumptions by showing the logical implications of the other person's worldview. So this is a tactic that's often used when you have identified a logical fallacy. Maybe you don't remember which one it is. That's okay. You don't need to, you're not trying to present a debate case, right? But you know there is a logical fallacy there, and so you're just drawing attention to it. You're taking the roof off of their argument, if you're referring to the argument as a house, right? So if the non-Christian says, man, Christians are so judgmental and intolerant. Well, we just talked about that in the last podcast. That's a logical fallacy. Just because you've met some Christians that are maybe judgmental and intolerant doesn't mean they all are, right? Our response could be, I understand where you're coming from. Maybe you can relate to them a little bit. I have met some judgmental Christians, so I can hear you on that one. Can you give me an example of when you felt judged by a Christian? Man, what a great question to ask. Because now you're showing you care about them, not just their argument, but then you get to hear their story. And then you get to actually love on them better. You get to address the arguments or debates or struggle they're presenting you with.
Yeah.
It's the taking the roof off tactic.
Yeah.
Third one is the steamroller tactic. This tactic is where you gently but firmly redirect the conversation when it becomes unproductive or hostile.
Oh man, this one's big.
Yes, this happens often. And we reference the ad hominem logical fallacy, where they start attacking you rather than the actual argument itself. This is where we use this tactic. Someone says, I don't understand why you believe in miracles. They defy logic. Or I don't understand how you can believe in Jesus because Christians always are X, Y, Z. Or maybe they attack you personally, like we said. Your belief is invalid because I've seen you make mistakes before, right? You fill in the blanks because we've all probably been there. You can respond by saying, hey, I understand and appreciate your perspective, but let's agree to disagree on this point and focus on some common ground. Right? You have to defend yourself a little bit. It's, hey, like, I'm sorry that you feel that way. I'm sorry that maybe I've made mistakes and I'm guilty for helping you arrive to that conclusion about me, but it has no bearing on the argument that we're making or the conversation that we're having. It's gently but firmly acknowledging what they're saying, but redirecting the conversation back to the argument itself, not about Christians in general or who you are or what you've said or their opinions of you. It's redirecting it. And the firmly part is important too, because you're drawing a line there and you're saying, hey, like, I'm not trying to attack you back, but I would love to have a conversation with you about this. That's the steamroller tactic. This next one is he refers to in the book the suicide tactic, and this is one that I think I have found myself using commonly, where it's the tactic involves exposing self-defeating statements or arguments made by the other person. Again, this is pointing out a logical fallacy gently and kindly. It's showing them how their argument falls in on itself, right? If someone says your faith is just wishful thinking, or maybe it's not so direct or argumentative against you. Maybe it's just like, Christianity. I just don't know how anyone has any belief in that. It just seems hopeless. Believe in Jesus. It just seems hopeless. Isn't it possible that dismissing faith as wishful thinking is also a form of wishful thinking? People make statements all the time like that where they just don't realize the statement that they're making is an argument against itself. That's why it's oftentimes referred to as the suicide tactic, because their argument has killed itself, right? And it's just you're gently pointing it out. In which case, those conversations, in my experience, go so well. Because if you do it right and you do it lovingly, they'll oftentimes be like, oh, wow, you're right. Like, I've never thought about that. Because if you've done your job and listening attentively and loving actively, they really believe you're on their side and that and you're trying to be, and that you do care about them more than you care about their argument. So when you point that out, usually they're like, wow, I've never thought about that. And there are a lot of arguments out there that fall in on itself. And that really starts with identifying the logical fallacies too in their arguments. And then the last one we'll talk about today is the inside out tactic. It's where you find common ground with the other person and use shared values or beliefs as a starting point for discussion. The inside out tactic. I don't see how Christianity is relevant to my life. I just don't think I need it. Why do I need Jesus? I don't understand. Hey, I understand where you're coming from. Can we explore together how Christianity addresses some of life's biggest questions and challenges? Maybe it's bringing your own testimony, your own story. Hey, I was right there with you at one point. Like I was you. I believed that same thing, or I even said those same things. Can I tell you my testimony? Can I share with you my experience with who Jesus is and my experience with Christianity? And that's oftentimes like another incredibly fruitful conversation, because you can't argue with logic, but you even more so, can't argue with somebody's testimony. That's your experience. You're not trying to argue them. You're not trying to bring a debate case. Here's my book on the validity of whatever you're talking about, the Bible or Jesus, Christianity, whatever. Here's why. No, just tell them your story. And our testimonies can be broken down into just 3 simple parts. Your life before you met Jesus, what brought you to faith in Jesus, what that experience was like, when was that, what happened, and then your life after you've met Jesus.
Yeah.
And that oftentimes is one of the most fruitful, again, conversations that you can have. And that's the inside out tactic. It's finding that common ground, maybe even sharing your testimony with that person. That becomes the starting point for a really great, fruitful conversation.
Yeah, I think with these tactics, they're extremely helpful in bringing clarity to the person that's making the defense. And in their response, you're going directly to the source of their concern. And you're steering the conversation in the right direction, where there's no rabbit holes, rabbit trails, any unnecessary details like added into the conversation. Like, you're avoiding all those things.
Yeah.
You're having a legitimate conversation on what actually needs to be talked about and what's the concern present.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll share too is let's not be hard on ourselves. It sounds like these are super easy, but when you're in the moment, we fumble it.
Yeah.
And sometimes we let our emotions get in the way. Sometimes we don't catch things. They're throwing all these statements at us and we start chasing them down, and it gets hard to address them. And then you're like, oh, wait, I could have used this tactic in hindsight. Let's not be hard on ourselves. As long as we're caring about the person, we're listening well, we're loving on the person in whatever way we can, we're winning. And again, we said it in the last episode, I believe, or the one before that, play the long game. Play the long game with that relationship with that person, and just tell them you care about them and you want to have these conversations with them, that you even enjoy them and you want to learn together, and it's helpful for you as well in your faith. Yeah,
it shouldn't be, with all the things that you're sharing, it shouldn't be taken in as like, all right, now I got the ammunition on how to fight.
Yep.
The priority, the heart posture is love first. These are all additives to being more equipped in handling those situations.
Yep. That's all it is. It's just seeking to prepare to give a defense for our faith for those who ask.
Yeah.
With all gentleness and respect.
That's good. Well, guys, thank you for joining us in this episode of the City Rev Life podcast. Please share with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. We'll see you guys back next time.
Thank you so much for listening to the City Rev Life podcast. Feel free to subscribe and leave a rate and review. We love it when you share it with your friends on social media, so don't forget to tag us at cityrev.church. If you're interested in more resources, download our City Rev Church app and follow us on social media. Have a great day.